Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the sound of 10,000 voices, all praying at once, in 3 different languages, none of them stopping for the others. Now open them. Dawn is breaking over Jerusalem. The sky is pale gold and bruised purple at the edges. The air smells of incense, of candle wax, of something older and harder to name. Stone, maybe. Dust that has been breathed by 100 generations. The western wall rises before you, massive and ancient and trembling, not from any earthquake, but from the press of human hands against its surface. It is Passover. Tens of thousands of Jewish pilgrims have come here tonight. Some have traveled from the other side of the world. Some have saved for years to make this journey. They press forward in the half-light, prayer books open, lips moving, eyes closed. Old men with white beards, young soldiers still in uniform, children lifted onto shoulders to see above the crowd. A woman in a blue headscarf reaches the wall and places both palms flat against the stone. She stands there. She does not move. Then her shoulders begin to shake. She is weeping, freeze on her face. Above her, just a few meters above, on the plateau of the Temple Mount, the golden dome of the Rock catches the first light of morning. Muslim worshippers have already begun their Fajr prayers. Their voices drift down over the wall, soft and steady and ancient. And a few hundred meters away, inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Christian pilgrims are lighting candles at the spot they believe marks the tomb of Jesus. The wax drips. The flames shiver. Someone is singing. The same 20 meters of stone. 3 faiths. 1 city. 1 impossible, bleeding, extraordinary city. Now cut to black. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. Drop it in the comments below. Now let's begin. This stone you just saw, the stone that woman pressed her hands against, is roughly 2,000 years old in its current form. But the bedrock beneath it is far, far older. People have been standing on this ridge, praying to something, reaching towards something, since before any of our religions existed, since before our civilizations had names. How does a city become the most contested piece of real estate in human history? Not by accident, never by accident. Jerusalem sits at the heart of the southern Levant, that narrow corridor of land connecting Africa, Asia, and Europe. It is not on a great river. It has no natural harbor. It is not rich in minerals or farmland. By almost every practical measure, it should be an unremarkable hilltop town. And yet, for 3,000 years, every empire that has ever wanted to claim the world has wanted this city first. That is the first mystery of Jerusalem. And we are going to spend the next several chapters unraveling it. But to understand what Jerusalem is, you first have to feel what Jerusalem does to people. And that woman at the wall, the one weeping, she is not an exception. She is the rule. Jerusalem does something to the human nervous system that almost no other place on earth does. Travelers have been writing about it for centuries. There is even a name for it now. Doctors in the city have documented a genuine psychological condition where visitors become overwhelmed by the spiritual intensity of the place. Delusions, trembling, the sudden conviction that they are biblical figures. It happens every year. It has a name, Jerusalem Syndrome. Think about that. A city so charged with human meaning that it can temporarily break your mind. Why here? Why this hill? The answer begins far earlier than most people expect. Long before King David, long before Moses, long before Abraham. Human beings were living in this region as far back as 10,000 years before our era, during a period archaeologists call the Natufian culture. These were hunter-gatherers becoming farmers, learning to stay in one place, learning to build. The land of Canaan, the ancient name for this region, was not empty when history began. It was already old. By around 1200 years before our era, something was crystallizing in the hill country of Canaan. A people were forming. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, the way a river cuts a canyon. The earliest written mention of Israel as a people does not come from the Bible. It comes from an Egyptian inscription. The Meneptah stela, carved around 1280 years before our era, records a military campaign by the pharaoh Meneptah. Among the peoples he claims to have defeated, one name stands out: Israel, a people, not yet a kingdom, not yet a city, just a people somewhere in the hills of Canaan, already ancient enough to be worth mentioning on a pharaoh's monument. That is where our story begins, not in a palace, not in a temple, in a hill country. Among people with dry throats and calloused hands, looking up at a ridge and deciding to call it home. The city that would become Jerusalem sits on that eastern ridge in the area archaeologists now call the City of David. It is a narrow spur of land flanked by two valleys. To the east, the Kidron Valley drops away sharply. To the west, the Tyropoeon Valley curves around it. The ridge is defensible. It has a water source, the Gihon Spring, one of the only reliable springs in the area. For people who needed water to survive, that spring was everything. It was the reason to build here. It was the reason to stay. Stand at the City of David today and look south from the Temple Mount. The ridge falls away below you, steep and narrow. You can see why someone looked at this place and thought, here we build, here we hold. By the Iron Age, two kingdoms had formed in this region: Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Jerusalem sat in Judah, and, according to tradition, it became the capital of a united monarchy under a king named David, around 1,000 years before our era. The Bible describes David capturing the city from a people called the Jebusites. His son Solomon, the tradition says, built the first temple on the ridge above, on the plateau that would become the Temple Mount. Whether every detail of that story is historically precise is a question scholars still wrestle with. But here is what is not in question. By the 9th and 8th centuries before our era, Jerusalem was real, growing, and important enough that the great empires of the ancient world were already noticing it, and that attention was not going to be kind. This is the part of Jerusalem's story that people often gloss over, because it is almost too much to absorb. This city, this one small city, has been destroyed and rebuilt 17 times. 17, not damaged, not partially burned, destroyed, leveled, rebuilt from rubble, then destroyed again. 17 times. Empires rose and fell around Jerusalem like waves around a rock. The Assyrians came. The Babylonians came and burned the first temple to the ground in 586 years before our era. The Persians came and allowed the exiles to return. The Greeks came under Alexander and his successors. The Romans came and destroyed the Second Temple in 70 years of our era, scattering the Jewish people across the known world in one of the great tragedies of ancient history. Then came the Byzantines, the Persians again, the Arab Caliphates, the Crusaders, the Mamluks, the Ottomans, the British. Each one left a layer, each one added to the stone. That is what you are looking at when you look at the Western Wall. You are not looking at one moment in history. You are looking at all of them, compressed into a single surface. The prayers stuffed into its cracks come from every century. The hands that have touched it belong to every generation of people who believed that this stone connected them to something permanent in a world that kept changing. And here is the thing that stops you cold when you really think about it. The three great religions that converge in Jerusalem today, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they all trace their roots to the same tradition, the same Abraham, the same lineage of faith, branching out over millennia into three rivers that now flow back to the same source and crash against each other in the same narrow streets. The same God, argued over with swords for 3,000 years. Jerusalem is not just a city, it is an argument, the longest argument in human history. Walk through the old city today and you feel it in your bones. The streets are narrow enough to touch both walls with your arms spread wide. The stones underfoot are worn smooth by millions of feet. The air in the covered markets smells of cardamom and roasting meat and old wood. Around one corner, a Jewish family is carrying Torah scrolls for a celebration. Around the next, a muezzin's call rolls down from a minaret above. A group of Christian pilgrims follows a guide along the Via Dolorosa. The path tradition says, Jesus walked on his way to crucifixion, and some of them are crying before they even arrive. In a city of less than 1 square mile of old city walls, all of this is happening at once, every single day. No other city on earth does this. Not Rome, not Mecca, not Varanasi. Jerusalem is the only place where 3 of the world's major religions not only share geography, they share the same specific stones, the same specific hilltop, the same specific claim to divine ownership. And that overlap is not accidental. It is the accumulated weight of 3,000 years of history, each generation building on top of the last, each faith inheriting the city from the one before and refusing to let go. That refusal is what makes Jerusalem what it is. It is also what has made it bleed. The woman at the wall is still there in your mind, isn't she? Her hands flat against the stone, her shoulders shaking. She is not weeping because she is sad, not exactly. She is weeping because she is overwhelmed, because she has traveled her whole life toward this moment, because the stone is real and solid and ancient, and it does not care about politics or borders or the arguments of nations. It just stands there, the way it has stood for 2,000 years, receiving the grief and the gratitude and the desperate hope of every person who has ever pressed their forehead against it and whispered something they could not say anywhere else. That is Jerusalem, not a symbol, not a metaphor, a place, a real, specific, impossibly dense place where human history has been happening without pause since before most civilizations learned to write. And we are going to walk through all of it, together. The stone is the same, the prayers are the same, but everything else has changed 17 times, and the 18th change may be waiting just ahead. We need to know why this place, this impossibly small place, has been worth fighting for since the dawn of history. We're still feeling the weight of that woman's hand on the stone, her shoulders shaking, her breath held against something older than memory. Now we go back. Not through tidy history, through legend and dust and the sound of men climbing a hill they were told they could never take. Around 1,000 years before the Common Era, Jerusalem does not belong to Israel. It belongs to the Jebusites, a Canaanite people. They have lived on this ridge, this specific limestone ridge between 2 valleys, for centuries, and they are confident, dangerously confident. The city sits on high ground, ringed by steep slopes on 3 sides. The Kidron Valley drops away to the east. The Tyropoeon Valley cuts along the west. The natural defenses are so strong that the Jebusites, according to the Hebrew Bible, actually mock the approaching Israelites. They say the blind and the lame could defend this city. That is how impossible it looks from the outside. David looks up at those walls and does not flinch. He is already the most complicated figure in this entire story. A shepherd boy who killed a giant, a fugitive who lived in caves, a poet who wrote songs to God, a warrior who left bodies in the field without hesitation. He is all of these things at once, and the tension between them never quite resolves. Not in life, not in the 3,000 years of storytelling that follow. Most of what we know about David comes from the Hebrew Bible. Historians are careful here. David's reign is thought to have occurred somewhere around the 9th or 10th century before the Common Era, though the exact time frame is genuinely disputed. The geographical reach of his kingdom is argued over. The man himself sits at that uncomfortable border between history and scripture, between archaeology and faith. But here is what we can say. Someone took Jerusalem, someone made it a capital, and whoever that person was, they changed the world. The city David approaches is small by later standards. The original settlement core sits on the southern part of the eastern ridge, the place archaeologists now call the City of David. It is not vast, it is not glittering. It is a fortified hill town, dense and practical, built to survive. The smell of it would have been animals and cook fires and the dry heat rising off pale stone. The sound of it would have been wind moving through the valleys below and the distant noise of men preparing for something they did not fully expect to survive. David takes the city. The Bible is brief about exactly how. There is a reference to a water shaft, a passage through the rock that may have allowed his fighters to enter from below rather than breach the walls from outside. Whether that is literally true, whether it is symbolic, whether it reflects some older tradition of siegecraft, nobody can say for certain. What matters is the outcome. The Jebusites lose, David wins, and he does something that changes the meaning of this moment entirely. He stays. He does not garrison the city and move on. He does not treat it as a military prize to be catalogued and left behind. David makes Jerusalem his capital. He calls it the City of David. He brings his household here. He roots himself in this specific hilltop, in this specific piece of ground, and in doing so, he binds himself to it permanently. The city and the king become inseparable in ways neither of them could have anticipated. But the military victory is only the first layer. What comes next is the act that transforms everything. David brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Think about what that means to the people watching it arrive. The Ark is not just a sacred object, it is the physical presence of God among the Israelites. It is the container of the tablets given to Moses on Sinai. It has traveled with the people through the wilderness, through wars, through generations of wandering. It is being captured and returned. It carries the weight of every promise ever made between this people and their God. And now, David is bringing it here. To this city he just took by force. To this ridge above these valleys. He dances before it in the street. The Bible says he dances with abandon, with his robes flying, with a kind of reckless joy that embarrasses the people watching from windows. His wife Michal looks down at him and feels contempt. He does not care. He is not performing. He is overwhelmed. He is a man who has spent his whole life running, fighting, surviving, and now the holiest thing in the world is coming into his city, and his body cannot hold that feeling still. The Ark enters Jerusalem, and in that moment the city becomes something it was not before. It is no longer just a fortress on a hill, it is a sanctuary. A place where heaven and earth are understood to touch. The political capital of a newly unified kingdom has become, simultaneously, the spiritual center of a people's entire relationship with the divine. That doubling, that overlap of power and holiness, is exactly what makes Jerusalem so difficult to govern from that day forward. And David feels it almost immediately. He wants to build a temple, a permanent house for the Ark, a structure worthy of what it contains. He is a king with resources now, with ambition, with the momentum of victory behind him. But the answer he receives through the prophet Nathan is no, not you. You are a man of war. Your hands have shed blood. The temple will be built by your son. David receives that answer and goes quiet. He does not argue. He does not rage. He sits with it. And if you have ever been told that the thing you wanted most, the thing you built your whole life toward, will be given to someone else, you understand something of what that silence costs. He begins gathering materials anyway: timber, stone, gold. He cannot build the temple himself, but he can prepare everything his son will need. That is the kind of man David is. Flawed in ways the Bible does not hide, violent in ways that make uncomfortable reading, and yet possessed of a devotion so fierce and so personal that it outlasts every failure. Because David fails, repeatedly. The story of his reign is not a clean arc of triumph. There is the matter of Bathsheba, a woman he takes while her husband Uriah is fighting David's own wars. He arranges for Uriah to be placed where the fighting is thickest. Uriah dies. David marries Bathsheba. The prophet Nathan confronts him directly, and David does not deflect or make excuses. He says, "I have sinned against the Lord." 4 words, no justification, just the bare acknowledgement of what he has done. That moment is one of the strangest in the entire Hebrew Bible. A king, at the height of his power, admitting wrongdoing without being forced to. It does not erase what he did. Nothing erases it. But it tells you something about the texture of this man, about why the tradition holds him so tightly even across 3,000 years of scrutiny. His reign fractures in other ways too. His son Absalom rebels against him. David flees Jerusalem barefoot, weeping, climbing the Mount of Olives while his own people choose sides. He comes back. Absalom dies. The king returns to his city. But the city has seen his weakness now, and cities remember. He grows old. The Bible describes him as cold in his final years, unable to get warm even under blankets. The man who danced in the street is now a figure wrapped in silence, passing power to a son who is not yet ready to hold it. Solomon takes the throne. He is young, he is brilliant, and almost immediately he begins to dream on a scale his father never quite reached. David built a capital. Solomon intends to build a monument, not just a palace, though the palace will come. Something else first. Something that will take years and tens of thousands of workers and materials hauled from Lebanon and Egypt and places further still. A temple. The temple will sit on the high ground of the city, on the ridge above the city of David, on the place that tradition names as Mount Moriah, the place where Abraham once raised a knife above his son and heard a voice that stopped his hand. Sacred ground layered on sacred ground. The holiest object in the world, housed in the holiest place in the world, in the holiest city in the world. You can hear how this gets complicated, because a temple of that scale is not just a religious act. It requires labor, it requires taxation, it requires the kind of centralized power that not everyone in a loose confederation of tribes is eager to surrender. The unity that David forged through personality and warfare, and the sheer force of his presence, Solomon will attempt to maintain through architecture and administration. Those are different tools. They work differently on people. The stone is being chosen. The plans are being drawn. The cedar is being cut in Lebanon and floated down the coast. And somewhere in that enormous logistical enterprise, the city is changing in ways nobody fully tracks until it is too late. Jerusalem is being transformed from a place where a king lives into a place where God lives. That is not a small shift. It is the kind of shift that turns a city into an idea. And ideas, unlike cities, cannot be governed. They cannot be taxed. They cannot be negotiated with. They can only be fought over. David's Jerusalem was a city of arrival, a place a man chose on a specific morning, standing on a specific hillside, looking up at walls he had been told were impossible. He chose it, he claimed it, he danced in its streets with everything he had. Solomon's Jerusalem will be something else entirely, something that outlasts any king who ever sat inside it, something that will draw armies and pilgrims and fanatics and dreamers across every century that follows. David dies. His son Solomon takes the throne, and Solomon makes a decision. He will build not just a palace, but a temple so magnificent, so costly, so demanding that it will fundamentally change what Jerusalem means. The city of kings is about to become something far more dangerous, the city of God. And that choice will not end in glory. The woman's tears at the Western Wall make sense now. This stone has always been about more than stone. It has always been about power wearing the mask of piety. And that mask is cracking. It cracked the first time a king decided that God needed a house. Not because God asked for one, because a king did. Solomon inherits a kingdom still warm from his father's hands. David gave him borders, enemies defeated, a city chosen and claimed. What Solomon inherits is momentum, and momentum, in the hands of an ambitious man, becomes architecture, becomes spectacle, becomes something that costs far more than the man spending it ever has to pay himself. Picture the vision, not the finished temple, not yet. The vision. Solomon stands on the ridge of Mount Moriah, just north of the old city David took from the Jebusites. He looks out over a hillside that is mostly rock and wind. And somewhere in that barren elevation, he sees something nobody else can see yet. He sees the house of God. He sees Israel made permanent. He sees his own name written in stone that will outlast every army ever sent to erase it. That is an intoxicating thing to see. It is also a dangerous one. The construction begins around 960 BCE. The scale of it is staggering for its time. Cedar wood arrives from Lebanon, floated down the Mediterranean coast in massive rafts. The Phoenician king Hiram of Tyre supplies the timber and the craftsmen, because Solomon's Israel does not yet have the skilled labor for what he intends to build. Hiram sends architects, he sends metalworkers, he sends men who know how to make bronze sing and gold gleam in lamplight. In return, Solomon sends grain and oil, 20,000 measures of wheat every year, 20,000 measures of oil. The transaction is enormous. It is also relentless. The stone comes from quarries cut into the hills around Jerusalem. Enormous blocks, dressed so precisely that no iron tool rings against them on the construction site. The cutting happens somewhere else, somewhere out of earshot of the holy hill, so that the sacred work proceeds in silence. That detail is worth sitting with. The violence of creation, all that splitting and hammering, happens far away. What arrives at the Temple Mount is already shaped, already obedient. The rough work is hidden. Only the beauty is allowed to be seen. That is not just a construction method. That is the theology. Inside, the temple is covered in gold. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, the altar, the cherubim that spread their wings over the innermost sanctuary, the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant will rest. Gold over cedar, gold over carved gourds and open flowers, gold over everything, until the whole interior blazes in the light of the lampstands, like something that does not belong to the ordinary world. Which is exactly the point. 7 years it takes to build. 7 years of continuous labor, continuous cost, continuous demand on a kingdom that is wealthy but not infinite. And here is where the vision starts to curdle. Because temples do not build themselves. They are built by men. Specific men with specific backs and specific hands and specific families waiting at home in specific villages. Solomon conscripts them. 30,000 men sent to Lebanon in rotating shifts, 10,000 at a time, 1 month working and 2 months home, 80,000 stonecutters in the hills, 70,000 carriers, over 3,000 supervisors to manage the whole operation. These are not volunteers moved by religious devotion. These are men taken from their fields and their families by the authority of a crown that has decided God's house comes before their own. Imagine being one of them. You are a farmer in the hill country north of Jerusalem. It is planting season. Your family depends on what goes into the ground this month, and the king's men arrive in your village with a list of names. Your name is on it. You have 1 day to arrange your affairs. Then you walk. The grain your family needed, that gets taken too. Tax collectors follow the conscription orders like a second wave. The temple requires not just labor but revenue, not just hands but harvest. The villages of Israel empty out in stages. First the young men, then the grain, then the oil, then whatever surplus anyone had managed to scrape together against a bad season. The temple rises. It is breathtaking. It is also built on hunger. This is the thing about great monuments. They are always built on something. Usually something that the monument itself is designed to make you forget. You stand in the golden light of the sanctuary and you feel the presence of God, and you do not think about the man who cut the stone and cannot afford to feed his children this winter. The architecture is designed to make you feel transcendence. It is very good at its job. Solomon dedicates the temple in a ceremony of staggering scale. 22,000 oxen sacrificed, 120,000 sheep. The smoke rises over Jerusalem for days. The smell of it, blood and burning fat and cedar smoke, hangs over the whole city like a permanent cloud. The priests move through it in their linen robes. The people press in from every direction. Too many to count, too many to fit in the courts, spilling down the hillsides and into the streets below. Solomon stands before the altar and spreads his hands toward heaven and prays. It is a magnificent prayer. It asks God to hear the cries of the people when they come to this place in their need. It asks for forgiveness, for rain in drought, for deliverance from enemies. It is a prayer that sounds like it was written for the powerless. It was delivered by the most powerful man in the kingdom. That gap between the prayer and the man praying it is where everything eventually breaks. Because Solomon does not stop at the temple. He builds a palace complex that takes 13 years to finish, longer than the temple itself. He builds a hall of judgment, a house for his Egyptian wife, administrative buildings, a throne of ivory and gold with 6 steps and 2 lions standing beside each arm. He builds and builds and builds, and every building requires the same calculus: labor taken, grain taken, young men pulled from villages that are slowly running out of young men to pull. The northern tribes feel this most. They are farther from Jerusalem, less invested in its symbolic weight, more aware of what the king's projects cost them personally. They had joined David's kingdom because David was a man worth following. Solomon is a structure, a system, a tax collector wearing a crown. There are voices that say so out loud. The prophets begin to speak, not yet with the full thunder of Amos or Isaiah, but the early murmurs are there. Men who stand in public places and say that a God who demands justice for the widow and the orphan cannot be properly worshipped in a building that was built on injustice. That the gold on the walls came from the mouths of children. That the smoke rising from the altar smells less like devotion and more like political theater. Solomon does not listen, or rather, he hears and keeps building. He also makes alliances through marriage. 700 wives of royal birth, 300 concubines. Each alliance brings a foreign woman into Jerusalem, and each foreign woman brings her gods. Solomon builds high places, shrines on the hills outside the city, for the gods of Moab and Ammon and Sidon. He worships there himself in his old age, when the administrative machinery of the kingdom grinds on without much need for his personal attention. The man who built the house of God ends his reign burning incense to gods his father would have considered enemies. The prophets notice this too. Solomon dies around 930 BCE. He has reigned for 40 years. He leaves behind the most magnificent building in the ancient Near East, a kingdom stretched to its limits in every direction, and a people who have been squeezed hard enough that they are ready to break. His son, Rehoboam, takes the throne. The northern tribes send a delegation to him almost immediately. Their message is simple: your father made our yoke heavy, lighten it, and we will serve you. It is a reasonable request from people who have been carrying an unreasonable burden. Rehoboam consults his father's old advisors, who tell him to listen, to ease the burden, to build goodwill. He then consults the young men he grew up with, who tell him something different. Tell them your little finger is thicker than your father's whole body. Tell them you will make it worse. He listens to the young men. The northern tribes walk away. They take 10 of the 12 tribes with them. They form their own kingdom, Israel, with their own capital, their own kings, their own religious sites. What remains loyal to the house of David is Judah in the south, with its capital at Jerusalem, and the small tribe of Benjamin. The great united monarchy that David built through a lifetime of war and will, and that Solomon maintained through spectacle and stone, splits apart in a single conversation. Jerusalem, suddenly, is the capital of a much smaller thing. This is the city's first great lesson in the cost of overreach. You can build something so grand, so demanding, so consuming that the very people who were supposed to be elevated by it feel crushed beneath it instead. And when they get the chance, they leave. They do not burn the temple. They do not attack Jerusalem. They simply turn around and go home. That quiet departure is somehow more devastating than any siege. The kingdom of Judah survives. Jerusalem survives. The temple stands, still gleaming on its hill, still drawing pilgrims and still requiring its maintenance and its taxes and its priesthood. But the world around it has changed. To the north, a rival kingdom. To the east, the desert and beyond it, powers that are growing. To the south, Egypt, old and hungry and never fully asleep. Jerusalem is no longer the center of a regional power. It is a small city on a contested ridge, surrounded by people who do not particularly wish it well. The prophets find their full voice now. Amos thunders against the rich who sell the poor for a pair of sandals. Isaiah walks through Jerusalem's streets and looks at the temple traffic, the buying and selling of sacrificial animals, the priests collecting fees, the wealthy making grand public offerings, and he says that God hates it, not dislikes it. Hates it. Take away the noise of your songs, God says through Isaiah's mouth. I will not hear the music of your harps. Let justice roll down like waters, righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. The temple, built to bring God close, has become, in the prophet's telling, the thing standing between Israel and God. The building has become a substitute for the behavior the building was supposed to inspire. People come to the temple and perform their rituals and go home and do nothing differently. They have paid their spiritual bill. God has been satisfied. The poor remain poor. The widow remains without protection. The orphan remains without food. The stone absorbs all of it. The prayers, the incense, the blood of 10,000 animals, the tears of the genuinely devoted, the cynical offerings of men who want God's blessing on transactions that deserve no blessing at all. The temple holds all of it without distinguishing. That is both its power and its problem. 3 centuries pass. 3 centuries of divided kingdoms, of small wars and alliances and prophetic warnings that mostly go unheeded. Jerusalem changes kings and changes fortunes and stays small and stays proud and stays convinced, somehow, that its specialness will protect it. Then, in 587 BCE, the army of Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon appears on the horizon, not for the first time, not even for the second. But this time they do not leave. This time they do not take hostages and tribute and go home satisfied. This time they stay until the walls break, until the city burns, until the temple, that golden, impossible dream on its hilltop, that building that took 7 years and cost everything, goes up in smoke. The priests carry out what they can. The ark, according to tradition, disappears at this point. Nobody knows where it goes. It is simply gone, and the silence where it was becomes the holiest absence in history. But that destruction is still 300 years away from Solomon's moment of triumph. And for now, the temple is finished. It is beautiful. It is terrible. And within 1 generation, it will tear a kingdom in half. Because when you build something so grand in the name of God, people will kill to control it. Jerusalem, suddenly capital of only half a kingdom, is about to learn what it means to be surrounded by enemies and to be trapped between its own contradictions. The weight we felt, that cycle of destruction and rebuilding, we now understand the pattern. Jerusalem does not die easily, but every time it rises changed. And every empire that thinks it can finally end that cycle is wrong. A child asks her mother if the temple will protect them. The mother looks at the smoke rising on the horizon. She pulls her daughter closer and says nothing. The Babylonian army has been here before. That is what makes this moment different from every previous siege. The soldiers outside the walls are not strangers. They came in 597 BCE, the first time, and they took the king. They took the treasures. They took thousands of Jerusalem's most skilled people, its craftsmen and priests and administrators, and they marched them east into captivity. And then they left. The city stood, the temple stood, and the people who remained told themselves that meant something. That God had intervened, that the walls had held because they were supposed to hold. They were wrong to believe that, because now, 10 years later, the army is back. And this time, Nebuchadnezzar has not come to take and leave. He has come to finish it. The siege lasts 18 months. 18 months of watching the food run out. The smell of the city changes slowly, from bread and smoke and animal sacrifice to something sour, something desperate. People eat what they can find. The wells stay full, but the granaries empty. Children grow quiet in the way that children only grow quiet when something has broken inside them. The priests keep the temple rituals going as long as they can, because stopping feels like admitting what everyone already knows. Then the walls break, not with a single dramatic crash. They crack, and then they open, and then the soldiers pour through. And everything that followed is recorded in the Book of Kings with a kind of flat, terrible precision. The temple is burned. The royal palace is burned. Every significant building in Jerusalem is burned. The walls themselves are torn down, stone by stone, so that nothing remains that could anchor a future rebellion. Nebuchadnezzar's general, a man named Nebuzaradan, oversees all of it with the calm efficiency of someone who has done this before. The priests carry out what they can. The sacred objects, the bronze pillars, the great bronze sea that stood in the temple courtyard, they are stripped and melted down and taken to Babylon as trophies. And the Ark of the Covenant, that gold-covered chest that supposedly held the tablets of the law, the holiest object in a holy city, simply disappears. No one records where it goes. No one records who took it or what happened to it. It is there, and then it is not there. And the silence it leaves behind becomes its own kind of monument. The people who survived the siege are marched east, not all of them. The very poorest are left behind, the ones Babylon considers too broken to be worth transporting. But the community that matters, the priests, the scholars, the leaders, the people who carry Jerusalem in their heads, they walk away from the rubble toward a foreign river and a foreign sky. This is the Babylonian captivity. And here is what makes it extraordinary. Most peoples, when conquered and exiled, dissolve. They lose their language, they lose their gods, they intermarry and assimilate, and within 3 generations they are simply part of the conquering culture. It happens over and over throughout ancient history. Conquered peoples disappear. That is the normal outcome. It does not happen here. Beside the rivers of Babylon, something hardens instead of dissolving. The exiles write. They compile. They argue. They take the oral traditions and the scattered scrolls, and they begin assembling what will eventually become the Hebrew Bible. They do this precisely because they have lost everything physical. The temple is gone. The city is gone. The kingdom is gone. So they build something that cannot be burned. They build a text. They build a memory. 50 years pass. Then, in 538 BCE, everything changes again. Babylon falls. Not to Jerusalem, which has nothing left to fight with. Babylon falls to Persia, to a king named Cyrus the Great, and Cyrus does something that almost no conqueror in the ancient world does. He issues a decree allowing exiled peoples to return to their homelands. He is not doing this out of generosity exactly. He is doing it because a policy of allowing subject peoples to maintain their cultures and temples is simply better administration than constant suppression. But for the exiles on the banks of Babylon's rivers, the reason does not matter. What matters is the permission. They walk home. Or rather, some of them do. Because here is the complicated truth about the return from exile. Not everyone wants to go back. 2 generations have been born in Babylon. Some families have built lives, businesses, relationships. The land they are returning to is rubble. Jerusalem, when the first groups of returnees arrive, is a field of broken stones. The Temple Mount is a ruin. The walls are gaps and weeds, but they rebuild. It takes decades. It is grinding, unglamorous work. Nothing like the glory of Solomon's original construction. The Second Temple, completed around 515 BCE, is smaller than the first, simpler. The old priests who remember the original temple weep when they see it, because it is not what was lost. But the younger ones shout with joy, because they have never seen it at all, and this is theirs. Jerusalem breathes again, not grandly, not triumphantly, but it breathes. Then the Greeks arrive. Alexander the Great sweeps through the region in 332 BCE. Jerusalem submits without a fight, which is the wisest thing it can do when Alexander is in the mood he is in. Alexander, to his credit, leaves the temple alone. He has no particular interest in destroying local religions. He is building an empire, and empires need stability more than they need theological arguments. But Alexander dies young, and what follows is worse than Alexander in some ways because it is slower and more insidious. His empire fractures among his generals. The region passes to the Seleucids, a Greek dynasty ruling from Syria, and the Seleucids have a project. They want to Hellenize everything they touch. They want Greek language, Greek customs, Greek gods spread uniformly across their territory like a coat of paint over everything that came before. For many people in Jerusalem, this is fine. Greek culture is sophisticated, cosmopolitan, genuinely attractive. A significant portion of the city's elite embraces it willingly. They build a gymnasium. They compete in Greek athletic games. They speak Greek in public. This is not coercion. This is aspiration. But for others, it is a slow erasure. And then, under the Seleucid king Antiochus IV, it becomes something much worse than slow. In 167 BCE, Antiochus does something that no foreign ruler had dared to do. He enters the temple and desecrates it. He installs an altar to Zeus on the sacred ground. He sacrifices pigs there, the most ritually impure animal in Jewish law. He bans the observance of the Sabbath. He bans circumcision. He burns Torah scrolls. He is not trying to convert Jerusalem's population through persuasion. He is trying to destroy the thing that makes them a distinct people by destroying the practices that hold that distinctness together. The smell of pig blood in the temple. Think about what that means to someone who has organized their entire life around the sanctity of that space. The response is the Maccabean revolt. A priest named Mattathias and his 5 sons, the Maccabees, begin an armed resistance in the hills of Judea. It is guerrilla warfare against a professional army. It should not work. For years, it barely does. But the Seleucid Empire is stretched thin, distracted by other conflicts, and the Maccabees are fighting on ground they know for something they would rather die than surrender. By 164 BCE, they have retaken Jerusalem. They purify the temple. They rededicate it. The festival of Hanukkah, still celebrated thousands of years later, commemorates this moment. A small lamp burning longer than it should. A small people surviving longer than anyone expected. For roughly a century, under the Hasmonean dynasty descended from the Maccabees, Jerusalem rules itself. It is not a golden age exactly. The Hasmoneans fight each other as much as they fight external enemies. Rival brothers contest the throne. Religious factions, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and others, argue bitterly about what Judaism should be. The city is alive with conflict, which is another way of saying it is alive. Then, in 63 BCE, a Roman general stands at the gates. His name is Pompey. He has just reorganized the entire Eastern Mediterranean into Roman order, and Jerusalem is next on his list. He is not here because Rome hates Jerusalem. He is here because 2 Hasmonean brothers are fighting each other for the throne, and both of them foolishly have appealed to Rome to back their claim. Pompey arrives, looks at the situation, and simply takes the city for himself. He walks into the temple. He goes into the innermost sanctum, the Holy of Holies, the room that only the high priest entered once a year on the Day of Atonement. He goes in and he looks around. And then, in an act that surprises everyone, he leaves without touching anything. He does not take the temple treasury. He does not desecrate the altar. He is Roman enough to understand that unnecessary religious provocations are bad policy. But his restraint is not freedom. Jerusalem is now a client state of Rome. It pays tribute. It takes orders. Its kings rule only at Roman pleasure. For decades, the city negotiates this reality. Herod the Great, appointed king by Rome in 37 BCE, is a builder of extraordinary ambition and a man of extraordinary cruelty. He expands the Temple Mount into one of the largest religious complexes in the ancient world. The platform he constructs, a massive engineering achievement, still exists today. The retaining wall on its western side is still standing, and people still press their foreheads against its stones and whisper prayers into its cracks. But Herod's temple, magnificent as it is, cannot hold back what is coming. By 66 CE, the accumulated resentments have built into open revolt. The Jewish-Roman war begins with a massacre in Caesarea, with tax grievances and religious insults, and the particular fury of a people who have been ground down for too long. Jerusalem becomes the center of the rebellion. The city fills with fighters and factions and desperate hope. The Romans respond the way Rome always responds, methodically, massively. In 70 CE, the general Titus surrounds Jerusalem with 4 legions. The siege is brutal in ways that the Babylonian siege, 6 centuries earlier, rhymes with but does not quite match. The famine inside the city becomes catastrophic. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing afterward, records scenes that read like the end of the world. Families fighting over scraps, bodies too numerous to bury, the sound of weeping so constant it becomes a kind of silence. The Romans breached the outer walls in May. They breached the inner walls in July. And on the 9th of Av, a date that Jewish tradition had already associated with the destruction of the first temple, the second temple catches fire. Whether Titus ordered it burned or whether it happened in the chaos of battle, the sources disagree. What is not disputed is what happens next. The building burns. The stones crack in the heat. The golden roof melts and runs between the stones, and Roman soldiers pry apart the blocks to get at it, which is why no stone is left upon another. Not an act of theology, an act of greed. But the result is the same. Titus walks through the ruins. He looks at what remains of the building that Solomon began, that survived exile, that was rebuilt by returning exiles with calloused hands and stubborn faith, that Herod expanded into a wonder of the ancient world. It is ash and broken stone and the smell of burned cedar and melted gold. Roman soldiers carry the temple's great golden candelabra, the menorah, out through the rubble and load it onto a cart. It will be displayed in Rome's triumphal procession. Carved in relief on the Arch of Titus, it is still visible in Rome today. The image of that procession, Roman soldiers carrying away Jerusalem's light, is one of the most haunting images in human history. For the first time in Jerusalem's long story, it is not a Hebrew king or a foreign conqueror who decides the city's fate and then leaves it to its own people. An empire has decided. An empire has destroyed. And unlike Babylon, Rome does not exile the people to a distant river and leave them to their coherence. Rome disperses them across the known world, and the temple is gone, and there is nothing to come back to. But here is the thing. Here is the thing that no empire ever quite calculates correctly. In the rubble, something grows. The rabbis who survive begin doing what the exiles in Babylon did centuries before. They build something that cannot be burned. They take the temple worship, the sacrifices and the rituals and the sacred calendar, and they transform it into something portable. Prayer replaces sacrifice. The synagogue replaces the temple. The text becomes the home that a people can carry with them anywhere. A faith that needs no temple, no stones, no specific hilltop in a specific city. And that faith will prove more durable than any wall Rome ever built. The cycle continues, but the nature of conquest is changing. No longer is it about empires and military power. Now it's about faith. Now it's personal. Now it's absolute. And that makes it far more dangerous. The temple is ash. The city is rubble. Roman soldiers have marched home with their golden prize. And Jerusalem, stripped of its people and its purpose, should simply fade. That is what cities do when empires are finished with them. They go quiet. They become dust and memory and nothing more. But Jerusalem refuses, because something else has been growing in these streets. Something that began not with a king or a general, but with a carpenter from Galilee who walked into the city on a donkey, who turned over tables in the temple courts, who was arrested and tried and nailed to a cross on a hill just outside the city walls. His followers said he rose from that tomb. They said death could not hold him, and they said it happened here, right here, on this specific ground, in this specific city, under this specific sky. That claim changes everything. For the first followers of Jesus, Jerusalem is not just a capital. It is the hinge point of all human history, the place where God entered the world and conquered death. You cannot replace that with a different city. You cannot move it. It happened here, or it did not happen at all. So even as Rome reduces the city to stone and silence, Christians begin to arrive. They come quietly at first. They come to stand where he stood, to touch the ground where he fell, carrying the cross, to press their hands against the rock where the tomb was carved. The ruins are not a deterrent. The ruins are the point. This is where the world broke open, and no amount of Roman rubble can change that. For 2.5 centuries, Rome tolerates Christianity poorly. The early believers faced suspicion, then persecution, then the arena. The smell of that era is smoke and iron. The sound of it is silence, because Christians learn to worship in whispers and shadows. They are a faith that survives by going underground, literally and figuratively, gathering in catacombs and private homes, while the empire that crucified their founder watches from above. Then, in the early 300s, something shatters the pattern. Constantine becomes emperor of Rome. He converts to Christianity, and suddenly the faith that hid in catacombs is the faith of the most powerful man in the world. Constantine does not just tolerate Christians, he builds for them. He commissions churches across the empire, and in Jerusalem, he orders the construction of something extraordinary. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre rises over the site where Christians believe Jesus was crucified and buried. Construction begins around 325 and finishes around 335. It is enormous. It is magnificent. It is Rome saying, with stone and gold and soaring arches, that this spot of earth is the most important spot on the planet. Stand inside that church and close your eyes. The air is thick with incense, heavy and sweet, centuries of it soaked into the stone. Candles flicker in every corner. Pilgrims press forward, hands trembling, to touch the rock beneath the altar. Some weep, some cannot speak. They have walked for months to be here. Some have walked for years, and now they are here. And the rock is real, and the tears come before they even know they are crying. Pilgrimage becomes the great engine of Jerusalem's new life. Christians from across the empire, then across Europe, begin making the journey east. They come sick, hoping for healing. They come guilty, hoping for forgiveness. They come faithful, hoping simply to stand where he stood. The city fills again. Monasteries rise. Hostels for pilgrims appear along the roads. Jerusalem becomes a living destination, not just a memory. And then, in the 600s, the world shifts again. A merchant from Arabia receives a revelation. He recites it, and his followers memorize it, and it becomes the Quran. The faith it founds, Islam, spreads with a speed that stuns the ancient world. Within decades of the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632, Arab armies are moving north and west and east, carrying a new monotheism into lands that had been Christian or Zoroastrian or pagan for centuries. In 637, they reach Jerusalem. The man who accepts the city's surrender is Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab. He is the second caliph, the successor to the Prophet's political authority, and he arrives at Jerusalem's gates not on a warhorse in gleaming armor, but on a camel, wearing plain clothes, carrying his own provisions. The Christian patriarch of Jerusalem, Sophronius, meets him at the gates. He has been expecting a conqueror. He finds something harder to categorize. Umar walks into the city on foot. He is offered the chance to pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He declines. Politely, firmly, he steps outside and prays beside it instead. He says that if he prayed inside, future Muslims might use that as justification to convert it into a mosque. The Christian church must remain Christian. He says this, he means it. Think about what that moment contains. A military conqueror, victorious, standing at the holiest site in Christendom and choosing restraint. Choosing coexistence. It is not weakness. It is something rarer. It is wisdom with the confidence to be gentle. Under Muslim rule, Jerusalem becomes Al-Quds, the Holy One, because Islam too has a deep connection to this city. The Prophet Muhammad, according to Islamic tradition, made a miraculous night journey to Jerusalem and ascended from the Temple Mount into the presence of God. That mount, the place where the Jewish temple stood, is also the place from which the Prophet rose to heaven. It is sacred to Islam in a way that is bone deep and unquestionable. So on that mount, between 685 and 691, the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik constructs the Dome of the Rock. Look at it. Just look at it. An octagonal building covered in blue and gold tile, crowned with a golden dome that catches the sun from miles away. Inside, a massive outcropping of bare rock sits at the center. The same rock the Jewish tradition says is the foundation stone of the world, the place where Abraham prepared to sacrifice his son. The building surrounds it like a prayer made solid. The craftsmanship is so precise, so achingly beautiful, that it seems impossible that human hands made it. It seems like it floated down from somewhere else. It is one of the most beautiful buildings ever constructed, anywhere, by anyone. And here is what makes this period of Jerusalem's history so remarkable, so almost impossible to believe when you know what comes later. For roughly 4 centuries, 3 religions occupy this city together. Christians still worship at the Holy Sepulchre. Jews slowly begin returning. Muslims pray at the Dome of the Rock and at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which rises nearby on the same sacred mount. The streets carry the sound of church bells and the call to prayer and the chanting of psalms, sometimes at the same hour from different directions. Scholars call this period convivencia, coexistence. It is not a perfect peace. There are tensions, restrictions, moments of friction. Non-Muslims pay a tax. There are rules about what Christians and Jews can and cannot do. It is not equality as we would understand it now, but compared to what came before and what will come after, it is something close to miraculous. Pilgrims still come. Christian pilgrims from Europe still make the long journey east, and under early Muslim rule, they are generally permitted to do so. Jerusalem is not sealed off from the world. It remains a living city, a breathing city, a city where the sacred coexists with the ordinary, where a baker sells bread in the shadow of a golden dome, where children play in streets that prophets once walked. The air in Jerusalem in this period smells of baking bread and olive oil and the particular dry warmth of stone that has held the sun all day. In the evenings, the city cools quickly, and you pull your robe tighter against the sudden chill, and somewhere in the distance a voice rises in prayer, and for a moment the whole city seems to pause and listen. But no peace holds forever. Not in Jerusalem. In the 1000s, a new power rises in the Islamic world. the Seljuk Turks sweep out of Central Asia and begin conquering territory at a pace that alarms everyone. In 1071, they defeat the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert. Byzantium, the eastern remnant of the Roman Empire, begins to crack. The Seljuks take control of much of Anatolia, and their expansion pushes toward Jerusalem. When the Seljuks take control of the Holy City, the relatively tolerant arrangement that had existed begins to fray. Christian pilgrims find their journeys more difficult. Access to holy sites becomes uncertain. Reports filter back to Europe of pilgrims being harassed, turned away, sometimes worse. The stories travel from mouth to mouth, from town to town, growing with each telling. By the time they reach the ears of European nobles and bishops, they have become something vivid and urgent and outrageous. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I writes to Pope Urban II. He asks for military help against the Seljuks. He is asking for mercenaries, essentially. Professional soldiers to help shore up a crumbling frontier. What he gets is something much larger and far less controllable. In 1095, Pope Urban II stands before a crowd at Clermont in France and delivers a speech. We do not have his exact words, but we know the response. The crowd roars. They shout a single phrase that'll echo across the next 2 centuries. Deus vult. God wills it. God wills it. God wills it. Urban has called for a crusade, a holy war, a military expedition to take Jerusalem back from Muslim hands and return it to Christian control. He promises spiritual rewards to those who go. He frames it as pilgrimage with a sword. He frames it as God's command. Across Europe, men leave their farms and their families. Knights sharpen their swords. Peasants sew crosses onto their tunics. Priests preach in village squares, and the crowds weep and volunteer and march east, singing hymns into the cold morning air. Their feet are sore from the first day. Most of them have never been more than 30 miles from the place they were born. They are heading to a city many of them could not locate on a map, but they know it is holy. They know it is worth dying for. They have been told that God Himself demands it. It cannot last. In Europe, churches are filled with promises and stories of the Holy Land. The stories grow more exaggerated with each telling. What began as pilgrimage becomes obsession. Pilgrimage becomes crusade. And when the first crusade arrives at Jerusalem's gates in 1099, it will not come in peace. It will come with swords drawn. And Jerusalem, which has already been destroyed 17 times, is about to experience something new. It will be conquered by people who believe they are doing God's work by spilling blood. The woman weeping at the wall was weeping for all of this. For the blood, for the certainty that turned to slaughter, for a place that makes people righteous and then makes them monstrous. The Crusaders arrive at Jerusalem's gates in June of 1099. They have been marching for 3 years. Their boots are worn through. Their ranks are thinned by disease and starvation and the brutal heat of the Syrian desert. They have lost friends and brothers along the road. They have crossed mountains and rivers and 1,000 miles of hostile territory. And now, finally, they can see it. The city on the hill. The golden stones catching the morning light. Jerusalem. Some of them weep. Some fall to their knees in the dust. Some press their faces to the ground and pray. These are men who left their homes in France and England and Germany and Italy with one image burning in their minds: the holy city, the place where Christ walked and suffered and rose. They have carried that image across a continent. Now it is in front of them, real and solid and close enough to touch. But the city does not open its gates. Inside, the Fatimid garrison prepares to defend. The civilian population, Jews and Muslims mostly, braces behind the ancient walls. They have heard what the Crusaders did at other cities on the march. They have heard the stories. They know what is coming. The smell of fear inside those walls must have been thick, human, and sharp. The smell of people who have nowhere to run. The siege lasts 5 weeks. The Crusaders build siege towers out of whatever timber they can find in the barren hills around the city. They drag them forward under arrow fire. They pray. They fast. They march barefoot around the city walls in a religious procession, led by priests chanting psalms, while the defenders on the ramparts watch and mock them. It must have seemed almost absurd. An army of exhausted, sunburned Europeans circling a city in the blazing July heat, singing to God. Then the towers reach the walls. On July the 15th, 1099, the Crusaders breach Jerusalem's defenses. The first man over the wall is a knight named Godfrey of Bouillon. He does not wait. He does not hesitate. He drops into the city, and the men pour in behind him like a wave that has been building for 3 years and can no longer be stopped. What follows is not a battle. It is a massacre. The killing goes on for 2 days. Muslim men, women, and children are cut down in the streets, in the courtyards, on the steps of mosques. The Jewish community, which had lived in Jerusalem for centuries, is driven into the main synagogue. The building is set on fire. Those who try to escape are killed. Those who stay inside burn. The screams carry through the streets, mixing with the sound of steel on stone and the distant, steady chanting of priests who are already giving thanks to God. The blood, according to accounts written by the Crusaders themselves, ran through the streets. These are not enemy accounts. These are the victors, describing their own victory with something close to pride. One chronicler writes that the horses waded through blood up to their knees in the Temple Mount courtyard. Whether that is precise or exaggerated hardly matters. The men who wrote it wanted you to know the scale. They wanted you to understand the thoroughness of what they had done. And then the killing stops, and the Crusaders walk to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They kneel, they weep, they give thanks. Their hands are still stained, their swords are still wet, and they pray with the absolute conviction of men who have done exactly what God asked of them. This is the thing that is hardest to sit with. They were not ashamed. They believed the slaughter was righteous. They had been told that God willed it. And in that belief, something deeply human broke open and became something monstrous. Jerusalem does that to people. It has done it before. It will do it again. Godfrey of Bouillon refuses the title of king. He will not wear a crown of gold, he says, in the city where Christ wore a crown of thorns. He takes instead the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. He dies the following year. His brother Baldwin takes the throne without such hesitation, crowns himself king, and the kingdom of Jerusalem is born. It is a strange kingdom from the start, built on blood, administered by foreigners, surrounded on every side by enemies who have not forgotten what happened in those 2 days of July. The Crusaders call their new territory Outre-mer. It means simply across the sea, a name that tells you everything about how they see themselves, not as settlers, not as people who belong here, as men who have come from somewhere else and intend to hold what they have taken by force. The kingdom stretches at its greatest extent from the border of modern Turkey down through what is now Lebanon, Israel, and into parts of Jordan. 4 Crusader states anchor the region: the county of Edessa in the north, the Principality of Antioch along the coast, the county of Tripoli in between, and at the center, the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself, the jewel and the justification for all of it. The Crusaders build. They build with the energy of people who intend to stay forever. Churches rise on sacred sites. Fortifications are reinforced and extended. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is expanded and beautified. New towers go up along the city walls. Hospitals are established for pilgrims and soldiers. The Knights Hospitaller, a military order founded to care for the sick, begins to take on a fighting role. The Knights Templar, named for the Temple Mount where they are first quartered, become the most feared military force in the region. Christianity has become fully militarized. The monk and the soldier are now the same man. Pilgrims pour in from Europe. The roads east are busy with people making the journey that urban speech made feel not just possible, but obligatory. Jerusalem under Crusader rule becomes something it had not been under the Fatimids. It becomes a destination, a place to be visited, photographed in the mind, carried home as proof of devotion. The city fills with European languages. Latin Mass echoes from the great churches. The smell of incense drifts through streets that still carry the blood of the conquest in their stones. But the kingdom is never stable, never truly at peace. The Crusader lords fight among themselves over land and title and inheritance. The supply lines back to Europe are long and fragile. Every new generation of defenders has to be recruited from scratch, because the sons of Crusaders, born in the heat of the Levant, often choose to stay and become something in between, neither fully European nor fully local, speaking Arabic alongside French, trading with the people they were told to conquer. And outside the walls, the Muslim world is watching and waiting, and slowly, painfully, beginning to unite. For most of the 12th century, the Islamic world surrounding the Crusader states is fractured. Different rulers in Egypt and Syria and Iraq compete with each other as much as they resist the Crusaders. The Crusaders exploit these divisions brilliantly. They play rival Muslim rulers against each other. They form alliances that would have seemed unthinkable back in Europe. A Crusader lord and a Muslim emir trading and negotiating and occasionally fighting side by side against a common enemy. The Holy Land has a way of making theology bend toward pragmatism. But then a man is born in Tikrit, in what is now Iraq, in 1138. His name is Yusuf ibn Ayyub. The world will know him by another name, Saladin. He rises through the ranks of the Zengid court, serving a dynasty that has been slowly consolidating power across Syria. He is a soldier first, but he is also something rarer. He is a politician, a diplomat, a man who sees the whole board while other men see only the square in front of them. When the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt collapses, Saladin steps into the vacuum. He becomes Sultan of Egypt. Then he turns his attention north, to Syria, to the other Muslim rulers who are his rivals as much as the Crusaders are. One by one, through war and marriage and patient negotiation, he brings them under his authority. By the 1180s, Saladin controls Egypt, Syria, and much of the territory surrounding the Crusader states. The Crusaders are no longer surrounded by fractured enemies. They are surrounded by a unified force with a single will and a single purpose. And Saladin has made that purpose clear. He wants Jerusalem back. The Crusader kingdom feels the pressure. The new king, Guy of Lusignan, is a weak ruler in a position that demands strength. His court is divided, his barons argue, his military resources are stretched thin across hundreds of miles of contested frontier. And in the summer of 1187, Saladin makes his move. He crosses the Jordan River with an army that dwarfs anything the Crusaders can field. Estimates put his forces at around 30,000 men. The Crusader army, the largest they have ever assembled, numbers perhaps 15,000. Guy leads them out of their fortified position near the springs of Sepharia to relieve the city of Tiberias, which Saladin has besieged. It is a trap. Most of Guy's advisors know it is a trap. Raymond of Tripoli, one of the most experienced lords in the kingdom, tells him directly, "Do not march. Stay near the water. Do not let Saladin draw you into open ground in July heat with no water source in reach." Guy marches anyway. The Crusader army moves across the dry plateau toward Tiberias under a merciless sun. The temperature sits above 100 degrees. The men are in full armor. Their throats are cracked and raw. There is no water. Saladin's cavalry harasses them from every side, cutting off stragglers, setting fire to the dry grass so that smoke rolls over the exhausted column, choking men who are already barely moving. The sound of that march must have been terrible. The clank of armor and the silence of men, too thirsty to speak, and the distant drumming of Saladin's forces circling them like wolves. They stop for the night near a pair of volcanic hills called the Horns of Hattin. They cannot go forward. They cannot go back. In the morning, Saladin closes the trap. The Battle of Hattin on July the 4th, 1187, is over almost before it begins. The Crusader infantry breaks under the pressure of heat and thirst and the relentless assault from Saladin's archers. The cavalry charges but finds nothing to hold. The true cross, which the Crusaders carry into battle as a sacred relic and a symbol of divine protection, is captured. Guy of Lusignan is taken prisoner. The flower of the Crusader kingdom, the knights and lords who have held Outremer together for nearly a century, are killed or captured in a single afternoon on a burning hillside. The kingdom does not survive Hattin. It simply has no one left to defend it. City after city falls to Saladin over the following weeks. Acre, Jaffa, Ascalon, the coastal fortresses that have kept the Crusaders supplied and reinforced for generations. And then, in October of 1187, Saladin stands before Jerusalem. The garrison is small. The walls are defended by women and old men and a handful of knights who survived the disaster at Hattin. Balia of Ibelin, one of the last capable Crusader commanders, is inside. He had come to the city only to collect his family and leave. Saladin had given him safe passage for exactly that purpose. But the people of Jerusalem beg him to stay and command the defense. He sends a message to Saladin asking to be released from his promise of safe conduct. Saladin remarkably agrees. He releases Balian from his oath and allows him to take command of the city's defense. This tells you something about Saladin. He is not just a general. He is a man who takes honor seriously, even the honor of his enemies. The defense is hopeless. Balian knows it. He is commanding a city of 60,000 civilians with a few hundred fighting men. He negotiates. He stalls. He makes Saladin work for every inch. And when the walls are finally breached on October 2nd, 1187, he goes to Saladin and asks for terms. Saladin's first instinct is no mercy. Jerusalem was taken from Muslim hands with a massacre. Let it be retaken the same way. But Balian makes a cold and calculated threat. If Saladin will not grant terms, the Christians inside will destroy the city before surrendering it. They will kill the Muslim prisoners they hold. They will burn the mosques. They will tear down every holy site, stone by stone. They will leave Saladin nothing but rubble. Saladin pauses. He consults. He thinks. And then he agrees to terms. The Christians of Jerusalem are allowed to ransom themselves and leave. The ransom is set at 10 gold pieces for a man, 5 for a woman, 1 for a child. Those who cannot pay will be enslaved. Balian pays the ransom for 10,000 of the poorest from his own funds and from the city's treasury. Saladin's brother argues that the ransom terms are too generous. Saladin waves him off. He then releases another group of prisoners outright. Old men who have no families to ransom them, widows, children. He lets them walk out of the city without payment. No synagogue is burned. No church is destroyed. The Christian population leaves in an orderly column, watched over by Saladin's troops who are under strict orders not to harm them. The contrast with 1099 is so complete, so deliberate, that you have to believe Saladin knew exactly what he was doing. He was not just reclaiming a city, he was demonstrating something. That a Muslim ruler could take Jerusalem and keep his hands clean in a way that the Crusaders never managed. He restores the mosques. He has the Church of the Holy Sepulchre placed under the protection of 2 Muslim families, a tradition that continues to this day. He allows Eastern Christian communities to remain in the city and continue their worship. He rides through the streets of Jerusalem not as a conqueror burning with revenge, but as a man who has come home and intends to stay. The Crusaders are not finished. They will come back. They will fight for another century to reclaim what they lost at Hattin. There will be more crusades, more bloodshed, more sieges and truces and betrayals. The story of Outremer is not over in 1187, but something fundamental has shifted. The dream of a permanent Christian Jerusalem, a kingdom of God planted in the soil of the Holy Land and defended by holy warriors, has been broken. It will never be fully repaired. Saladin enters the city not as a conqueror seeking revenge, but as a general claiming his own. He spares the city. He protects the Christians. He shows mercy. And in that mercy, in that restraint, he teaches the Crusaders a lesson they will never forget: that the Holy Land does not belong to anyone by right of the sword, and that this city, sacred to three faiths, cannot be possessed. It can only be contested. Forever. 400 years is a long time to hold your breath, but that is almost what Jerusalem does. After Saladin rides through the gates in 1187, the city passes through more hands. The Crusaders claw back pieces of it, treaties carve it up. Pilgrims still come. Blood still falls on the stones. But by the early 16th century, a new power is moving across the map of the known world. Not from the west this time, from the east. And when it arrives in Jerusalem, it does something no conqueror before it had quite managed. It stays. The Ottoman Empire did not appear overnight. It grew slowly, the way empires always do, from a small principality in northwestern Anatolia, founded around 1299 by a tribal leader named Osman. His name would give the empire its name. His descendants would rule for 600 years. By the time Sultan Selim I turned his eyes toward the Holy Land in 1516, the Ottomans had already swallowed the Byzantine Empire, crossed into Europe, and built a state that stretched from the Danube to the deserts of Arabia. Selim moves into Syria and the Holy Land in 1516. He does not meet much resistance. Jerusalem, exhausted by centuries of war and changing rulers, opens to him. No siege, no massacre, no fire. The city simply becomes Ottoman, and that, quietly, is the beginning of something remarkable. Think about what Jerusalem had been through. Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantine emperors, Arab caliphs, Crusaders, Saladin, more Crusaders, Mamluk sultans. The city had been fought over so many times that its stones carried the memory of every army that had ever camped beneath its walls. And now the Ottomans arrive, and they do something radical. They govern it. Selim's son, Suleiman, is the one who truly shapes the Jerusalem we can still see today. He becomes Sultan in 1520. History will call him Suleiman the Magnificent. He earns it. Between 1538 and 1541, he rebuilds the city walls from the ground up. The walls you see if you walk through Jerusalem today, those great limestone ramparts with their towers and gates, those are Suleiman's walls. Not Roman, not Byzantine, not Crusader, Ottoman. Suleiman built them to last, and they did. Stand at the Jaffa Gate on a winter morning when the stone is cold and the air smells of rain and old dust. You are touching something Suleiman ordered built. That is not a small thing. But the walls are only the most visible part of what the Ottomans give Jerusalem. The deeper gift is the system. The Ottomans introduce what they call the millet system across their empire. Each recognized religious community governs itself. Muslims, Christians, Jews, each group runs its own courts, its own schools, its own religious institutions. The Ottoman state sits above all of them, collecting taxes, keeping order, settling disputes between communities. But inside each community, the old traditions hold. This is not equality. Be clear about that. Muslims hold the highest position in Ottoman society. Christians and Jews pay extra taxes. They face restrictions the Muslim population does not. It is a hierarchy. But within that hierarchy, there is space to live, space to pray, space to be something other than a refugee or a corpse. The Jewish community in Jerusalem, small and battered after centuries of persecution and expulsion, begins to grow again under Ottoman protection. Jews expelled from Spain in 1492, a wound so deep that Sephardic Jews would carry the memory of it for generations, find their way eastward into Ottoman lands. Some reach Jerusalem. They bring their language, their music, their prayers, their grief. They rebuild. The Christian communities, fractured into a dozen different churches that barely tolerate each other, somehow managed to coexist within the city's walls. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remains under the protection of Muslim families, a tradition that goes back to Saladin's time and continues through the entire Ottoman period. Greek Orthodox priests, Armenian monks, Franciscan friars, Coptic pilgrims. They share the same sacred spaces, bicker constantly over boundaries and rights, and somehow keep the candles burning. In the Muslim quarters, life moves to the rhythm of prayer. 5 times a day, the call rises from the minarets. The markets open before dawn and close at dusk. Merchants sell spices and cloth and copper pots in the same streets where Roman soldiers once marched. The smell of bread, baking, and coffee brewing fills the narrow alleys. Life is hard, often poor, sometimes dangerous. But it is life. Continuous, stubborn, ordinary life. Decades pass. Then a century. Then 2. The world outside Jerusalem transforms beyond recognition. The Renaissance reshapes European art and thought. The Reformation tears Christianity apart. The Enlightenment rewrites the rules of reason and authority. Explorers reach the Americas. Empires rise and fall across 3 continents. But in Jerusalem, the bells still ring at the same hours they always rang. The muezzin calls at the same moments. The Sabbath candles are lit every Friday at sundown. The city turns inward, ancient and self-contained, while history rushes past outside its walls. There is something both beautiful and suffocating about that stillness. Beautiful because it preserves, suffocating because it freezes. Jerusalem in 1700 looks strikingly similar to Jerusalem in 1550. The same markets, the same quarters, the same arguments over who controls which doorway in the Holy Sepulchre. The Ottoman administrators come and go. Some are competent, some are corrupt. Most are simply distant, focused on Istanbul and the larger dramas of empire, leaving Jerusalem to manage itself in the way it always has. The pilgrims keep coming. That never stops. Christian pilgrims from Europe and Russia and Ethiopia. Jewish pilgrims from across the diaspora coming to pray at the Western Wall, the last remnant of the Temple Mount's ancient retaining structure. Muslim pilgrims moving through the city on their way to or from Mecca. Jerusalem sustains itself partly on holiness, the sacred economy of a city that the world cannot stop visiting, no matter who rules it. But the 19th century is different. Something is moving in the world, something new and destabilizing, and it is heading straight for Jerusalem. It begins with Europeans, not soldiers this time. Something in some ways more dangerous. Diplomats, missionaries, scholars, tourists. They arrive with notebooks and cameras and ambitions. Britain opens a consulate in Jerusalem in 1838. Prussia follows, France, Austria, Russia. Each European power plants its flag in the city, not militarily, but institutionally. They build churches and hospitals and schools. They claim to be protecting this or that Christian community. What they are really doing is extending their influence into the last corner of the Middle East that does not yet belong to them. The Americans come too. Protestant missionaries who believe the return of the Jews to the Holy Land is connected to the second coming of Christ. They arrive with Bibles and good intentions and an agenda that has nothing to do with the people actually living there. Hotels open, roads improve. The first photographs of Jerusalem are taken. For the first time, Europeans who have never left their home countries can see what the city actually looks like. And seeing it, they want it. Not to live there, not most of them, but to possess it in some spiritual sense, to have it belong to their story. And then comes the idea that will change everything: nationalism. In the 19th century, across Europe and spreading outward, a new way of thinking about identity takes hold. People begin to believe that those who share a language, a religion, an ethnicity, a history, deserve their own state, their own land, their own flag. The idea tears apart old empires. It creates new countries. It also creates new conflicts. because the maps of the world are not clean, and people of different backgrounds have spent centuries living intermingled, side by side, in cities like Jerusalem. Jewish immigration to Jerusalem increases through the 19th century. Many come from Eastern Europe, fleeing the pogroms, the organized massacres and persecutions that devastate Jewish communities in Russia and Poland. They come not just as pilgrims, but as settlers. They come with a new idea, the idea that the Jewish people need a homeland, a real political homeland, not just a spiritual connection to the land of their ancestors. This idea, which will eventually be called Zionism, is still forming in the late 19th century. But its early tremors are already being felt in the streets of Jerusalem. At the same time, the Arab population of Jerusalem and the surrounding region is also developing a new sense of identity. Arab nationalism is stirring, fed partly by resentment of Ottoman rule, partly by the influence of European ideas, partly by a simple desire for self-determination. The Arabs who have lived in this land for generations, who have prayed in its mosques and tended its olive groves and buried their dead in its hillsides, are beginning to articulate something they have always felt but never needed to name, that this is their home. And the Christian communities have their own nationalisms, their own connections to European powers who claim to speak for them. The French claim to protect the Catholics. The Russians claim to protect the Orthodox. Each external power uses religion as a lever to push its way deeper into the city's affairs. What had worked for 4 centuries, the millet system, the quiet division of the city into communities that largely left each other alone, begins to crack. Not because the communities suddenly hate each other, but because the world outside has given them new languages to describe their differences, new reasons to compete, new audiences cheering for their particular claim. The Ottoman Empire is also weakening. The empire that seemed so permanent in Suleiman's day is now called the sick man of Europe. European powers circle it, waiting. Wars chip away at its edges. The central authority that once held Jerusalem's competing communities in a firm, if unequal balance, is loosening its grip. By the time the 19th century closes and the 20th begins, Jerusalem is still officially Ottoman. But the city has changed in ways that cannot be undone. New neighborhoods have grown up outside the old walls. Jewish immigrants have built communities that look nothing like the ancient Jewish quarter inside the city. European institutions have planted themselves across the landscape. The population is more diverse and more cosmopolitan than at any point in the city's history. And it is also, for the first time, beginning to fracture along lines that will prove impossible to heal. The cycle is about to restart. After hundreds of years of relative calm, Jerusalem is about to be caught in a new kind of conflict. Not between empires this time, between peoples claiming the same land as home. The Ottoman peace is ending, and what replaces it will be far more violent than anything Jerusalem has experienced since the Crusaders rode through its gates 1,000 years before. The nationalism that stirred in the 19th century has now exploded. The peaceful coexistence of the Ottoman centuries is shattered, and Jerusalem, which has always been a city of conquest, becomes a city of refugees, of loss, of people who both believe they have been dispossessed of their homeland. Picture a young Jewish man in Warsaw in 1882. The streets outside his window smell of fear. The pogroms have come again, that wave of organized violence that rolls through Eastern Europe every few years, burning, killing, leaving families shattered. He has heard about Palestine. He has read the pamphlets. He has felt something stir in his chest that he cannot name yet. It is not quite religion. It is not quite politics. It is something older and more desperate than either. It is the need to belong somewhere, to stand on ground that no one can take from you. He is not alone in feeling it. Across Central and Eastern Europe, Jewish communities are asking the same question. Not just where is home, but whether home can exist at all for a people who have been expelled from almost everywhere they have ever lived. The answer that begins to form is radical. build a new home. Go back to the ancient one. Go to Palestine. This is the dream that drives the earliest wave of Jewish immigration to Palestine in the 1880s. It is not yet called Zionism, not officially. The organizations forming in these years call themselves Hovevei Zion, the lovers of Zion. Between 1870 and 1897, they are responsible for establishing 20 Jewish towns in Palestine. 20 new communities planted in the soil of a land that already has communities of its own. The Palestinians living there, Arab Muslims, Arab Christians, communities with roots going back centuries, watch these newcomers arrive with a mix of curiosity and unease. At first, the tension is manageable. The land is vast enough, or seems to be, but the numbers grow, and the ideology hardens. In 1897, a Viennese journalist named Theodor Herzl convenes the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. He is not a religious man. He does not pray in the old way. But he has seen what Europe does to Jewish people, and he has drawn a cold, clear conclusion. Assimilation will not save them. Only a state will. His vision is secular and nationalist. A Jewish homeland, not because God promised it, but because a people without a homeland will always be at the mercy of those who have one. Not everyone in the Jewish world agrees. Many Haredi leaders, the most traditionally religious, reject Herzl's vision entirely. Their objection cuts deep. They believe that redefining Jewish identity around secular nationalism strips away the very thing that makes Jewish peoplehood sacred. They believe that the Jewish nation is not a political category. It is a covenant with God. For them, Herzl is not a savior. He is a danger. And before the State of Israel exists, the vast majority of Haredi Jews oppose Zionism for exactly this reason. But history does not wait for consensus. The immigrants keep coming. By the early 20th century, Palestine is changing visibly. New neighborhoods rise outside the old walls of Jerusalem. New languages mix in the markets. Hebrew, which had been a language of prayer and scripture for centuries, is being revived as a living tongue, spoken in homes, taught to children, used to buy bread and argue politics. This is not a small thing. A language reborn is an identity reborn, and the Palestinians feel it, not as an abstraction, as a daily reality. Land is being purchased, legally in many cases, from Ottoman landlords who do not always live on it. But the families who have farmed that land for generations, who have buried their grandparents in its soil, are displaced when the deeds change hands. They are not consulted. They are not compensated in any way that matches what they lose. They lose a relationship to a place that goes beyond ownership. They lose home in the deepest sense of the word. Arab nationalism is rising too, fed by the same currents of European thought that shaped Zionism. If peoples deserve self-determination, if nations deserve homelands, then Palestinian Arabs are a people, and Palestine is their homeland. The logic is identical. The land is the same. This is the collision course that the 19th century built, and the 20th century will not be able to avoid. Then the First World War changes everything. The Ottoman Empire, that weakened giant, enters the war on the side of Germany and loses. By 1917, British forces under General Edmund Allenby are marching toward Jerusalem. In December of that year, Allenby walks through the Jaffa Gate on foot. He does not ride a horse. He does this deliberately, as a gesture of humility before the Holy City. The Ottoman flag comes down. A new era begins. But before Allenby even enters the city, Britain has already made promises it cannot keep. In November of 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour writes a letter. It is addressed to Walter Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community. It is 89 words long. It will reshape the Middle East for the next century and beyond. The letter, which becomes known as the Balfour Declaration, states that Britain views with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. It also states that nothing shall be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. Read those two sentences together. Sit with them. A national home for one people, no prejudice to the rights of another, in the same land, at the same time. The British write these words as if they are compatible. They are not. And somewhere in London, in Paris, in Jerusalem itself, people who understand the situation look at those words and go very quiet. Britain also, in separate correspondence, has been encouraging Arab leaders to revolt against the Ottomans with promises of Arab independence after the war. Those promises and the Balfour Declaration cannot both be honored. Britain knows this. It proceeds anyway. Under the League of Nations, Britain receives the mandate for Palestine in 1920. It is now officially responsible for governing the territory and, somehow, fulfilling both sets of promises simultaneously. It will fail. But it will take nearly 3 decades for that failure to become undeniable. Through the 1920s and 30s, Jerusalem is a city of rising pressure. Jewish immigration accelerates. Arab resistance hardens. In 1920, riots break out in Jerusalem. In 1929, violence erupts again, more deadly this time, spreading across Palestine. In Hebron, dozens of Jewish residents are killed by Arab mobs. In Jaffa and elsewhere, Arab communities suffer at the hands of Jewish armed groups. Both communities are now afraid. Both are arming. Both are developing the organizations, the militias, the political structures that will eventually fight a war. The British respond with reports, commissions, and white papers. They restrict Jewish immigration. Then they lift the restrictions. Then they impose new ones. Every decision enrages one side without satisfying the other. The mandatory power is caught between two peoples. It has made promises to and cannot reconcile. Meanwhile, in Europe, something is happening that will make everything else irrelevant. The rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany begins in 1933. What follows is the most systematic attempt to destroy a people in recorded history. 6 million Jewish men, women, and children are murdered. 6 million. The smoke of the crematoria drifts over a continent that looked away. Families that had lived in Germany for generations. Families that had fought for Germany in the First World War. Families that had believed assimilation was the answer are loaded onto trains and taken to places with names that will echo forever. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Bergen-Belsen. The survivors, those who make it through, emerge from the camps into a Europe that has no place for them. Their homes are gone, their families are gone. Their neighbors, in many cases, do not want them back. Where do you go when the continent that was your home has tried to erase you from it? Palestine. The ships come. Some are turned back by the British, who are still trying to manage Arab anger by limiting Jewish immigration. There is a ship called the Exodus, carrying 4,500 Jewish Holocaust survivors, turned away from Palestine in 1947 and forced back to Europe. The images of those passengers, survivors of the worst atrocity in modern history, being returned to displaced persons camps in Germany, shock the world. International sympathy for Jewish statehood reaches a point that no political argument can overcome. The British, exhausted by the war, bankrupted by it, unable to govern a territory that has become a full-scale insurgency, hand the problem to the newly formed United Nations. They announce they will leave Palestine in May of 1948. In November of 1947, the United Nations votes on a partition plan. The plan divides Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab. Jerusalem, because of its unique status as a holy city to 3 faiths, is to be placed under international administration. Neither side gets the holy city outright. The Jewish leadership accepts the plan. It is not everything they wanted, but it is a state. It is real. It is something. The Arab states and Palestinian Arab leadership reject it. From their perspective, the plan asks them to accept the loss of more than half of a land that was overwhelmingly Arab in population just decades earlier. It asks the people who did not commit the Holocaust to pay the price for it. That argument has its own weight, its own grief, and the world does not fully listen to it. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion stands in Tel Aviv and reads out a declaration. His voice is steady. Around him, people are weeping. The state of Israel is declared. In Washington, President Harry Truman recognizes it within minutes. 11 minutes to be exact. The next morning, 5 Arab armies cross the borders. What follows is a war that both peoples call by different names. Israelis call it the War of Independence. Palestinians call it the Nakba, the catastrophe. Both names are accurate. Both names are true at the same time. That is the unbearable thing about this conflict. The truths do not cancel each other out, they compound. In the fighting, approximately 700,000 Palestinians flee or are expelled from their homes. Some leave in fear of the violence. Some are driven out at gunpoint. Some are told by Arab radio broadcasts that they should leave temporarily, that the Arab armies will win and they can return. They do not return. The villages they leave are, in many cases, demolished. New towns are built on the ruins. The keys to homes that no longer exist are kept by families in refugee camps, passed down to children born into exile, and then to grandchildren who have never seen the houses those keys once opened. This is the wound that does not close. In Jerusalem, the war is fought street by street. Jewish forces, what will become the Israeli Defense Forces, control the western part of the city. Arab Legion forces from Jordan, well-trained and well-armed, hold the eastern part. The Old City, with the Western Wall, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, falls under Jordanian control. The Jewish quarter inside the Old City, where Jewish families have lived for centuries, surrenders. Its residents are evacuated. Its synagogues are damaged. For the first time in living memory, Jewish worshippers cannot reach the Western Wall. For the first time in all of its history, Jerusalem is divided by a physical barrier, not a metaphorical line, a real one, barbed wire, concrete, armed checkpoints. A city that has been conquered and reconquered, that has passed between empires, that has been burned and rebuilt, now has a border running through its heart. Families who lived on one side find themselves cut off from relatives on the other. A Palestinian family in East Jerusalem cannot cross to visit friends in the West. An Israeli family cannot walk to the Old City, cannot stand at the wall, cannot touch the ancient stones that their tradition tells them are the holiest in the world. The city that 3 faiths call sacred is now a city of locked doors. The international community watches, debates, passes resolutions, declares that Jerusalem's final status must be determined by negotiation. Those negotiations do not happen, not yet, not for decades. And when they do happen, they will not resolve anything. When independence comes in 1948, it comes not as an end, but as a beginning. The city is partitioned. Israeli forces control the western side. Arab forces control the east, including the Old City. For the first time in history, Jerusalem is divided by a border, not a symbolic one, but a real wall. Families are separated. Entire neighborhoods become forbidden. And the international community watches, unable to decide, to whom does Jerusalem belong? The answer, it seems, is to no one, or perhaps to everyone, but no one will accept that answer. The woman's tears at the wall, we now understand them completely. This is what it means to live in a city that has been built and rebuilt 17 times. Each rebuilding comes with violence. Each piece is temporary. And the people living here, both Israelis and Palestinians, carry the weight of history that will not let them rest. The border cuts through the city like a knife, not a clean cut, a jagged one. The green line, they call it, named for the color of the ink an officer used on a map during the armistice negotiations of 1949. A man drew a line, and a city broke in two, Some streets are split directly in half, one side Israeli, one side Palestinian. Neighbors who had lived across from each other for decades now live in different countries. A woman hangs laundry in her courtyard in East Jerusalem and can see the windows of her sister's apartment in the west. She cannot walk there, she cannot call out. The line between them is not just barbed wire, it is a new kind of grief. For 19 years, this is Jerusalem, two cities wearing the same name. On the Israeli western side, a new state is building itself from nothing. Roads, schools, institutions. The smell of fresh concrete mixes with the older smell of dust and stone. Life is hard. Rationing, uncertainty. But there is momentum. There is the electric feeling of a people constructing something they have waited 2,000 years to build. West Jerusalem grows. It modernizes. It becomes the capital of a country that the world is still deciding whether to accept. On the Jordanian eastern side, the old city sits like a jewel in a contested crown. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa Mosque. And there, pressed against the ancient stones of the Temple Mount's western retaining wall, the western wall stands in silence. Jewish worshippers cannot reach it. For 19 years, the holiest site in Jewish tradition is simply unreachable. A wall, visible on maps, invisible to the people who ache for it most. Christian pilgrims can still cross through a single checkpoint at the Mandelbaum Gate. But the crossing is tense and bureaucratic and cold. You are searched. You are watched. The city that three faiths call sacred now treats every visitor as a potential threat. Inside the Jewish quarter of the Old City, the Jordanian authorities oversee the departure of Jewish residents. Synagogues that stood for centuries fall into disrepair. Some are damaged, some are used as stables. The Herva Synagogue, which had been rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt again across its long history, is demolished. The sound of that collapse echoes forward through decades. Palestinian families in the eastern half of the city live under Jordanian administration. They are not asked what they want. Nobody asks them. The armistice simply places them on one side of a line and tells them this is now their reality. Arab Jerusalem carries on. Markets open. Prayers are called. Children are born. But underneath the ordinary rhythms of daily life runs a current of displacement. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who fled or were expelled during the 1948 war are now refugees. They cannot return. The homes they left are on the other side of the line, or no longer standing or occupied by strangers. Both halves of the city are haunted, one by absence, one by loss. Then comes June of 1967. Egypt closes the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. Troops mass on borders. The air in the region feels the way it feels before a summer storm, heavy and electric and wrong. Israel launches a preemptive strike against Egypt on June the 5th. The sound of jets fills the morning sky over the Sinai. Within hours, the Egyptian Air Force is destroyed on the ground. Within days, Israel is fighting on three fronts simultaneously: Egypt to the south, Jordan to the east, Syria to the north. 6 days. The war lasts 6 days. On the third day, Israeli paratroopers push through the Lion's Gate and enter the old city of Jerusalem. The fighting through the narrow stone streets is brutal and close. Smoke hangs over the ancient alleyways. The smell of gunpowder settles into the same stones that absorbed the smoke of every conquest before this one. Men die in the same lanes where crusaders died, where Roman soldiers died, where every army that ever wanted this city has bled. And then the paratroopers reach the Western Wall. A photograph captures the moment. 3 Israeli soldiers stand at the wall, looking up at it. Their helmets are on. Their faces are young. One of them is weeping. You look at that photograph, and you feel the weight of 2,000 years pressing down on 3 young men who cannot quite believe where they are standing. General Moshe Dayan walks through the Lion's Gate and makes a declaration. Jerusalem, he says, will never be divided again. For Israelis, this is a moment of almost unbearable meaning. The wall is back. The city is whole. The prayer that Jews have ended every Passover Seder with for 2 millennia, next year in Jerusalem, suddenly feels like it has been answered. For Palestinians, this is a catastrophe layered on top of a catastrophe. The West Bank falls under Israeli military occupation. East Jerusalem, which Jordan had administered for 19 years, is now under Israeli control. Within weeks, Israel annexes East Jerusalem. The annexation is not recognized by the international community. The United Nations passes resolutions declaring it invalid. Israel does not reverse it. Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem find themselves in a new legal category. Not citizens, not quite subjects, permanent residents of a state they did not choose, in a city whose ownership is now disputed by everyone and resolved by no one. They can apply for Israeli citizenship, but most do not, because doing so feels like accepting a reality they refuse to accept. They hold on to their identity the way you hold on to something you are afraid of losing. Tightly, painfully. The green line disappears from Israeli maps, but it does not disappear from Palestinian memory. Nothing disappears from Palestinian memory. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Israeli settlements began expanding into the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Housing blocks rise on hilltops that Palestinians see as theirs. Roads are built connecting settlements to Israeli cities, bypassing Palestinian towns. The physical geography of the land begins to change in ways that will make any future negotiation dramatically more complicated. Every new building is a fact on the ground. Every fact on the ground is a message. The message is, we are staying. Palestinians watch the settlements grow from their windows. The feeling is not just anger. It is something closer to suffocation. The slow, daily experience of watching your world shrink. In December of 1987, a traffic accident in Gaza kills 4 Palestinian workers. The rumor spreads that the accident was deliberate. Within days, the first intifada begins. The word means shaking off. It starts as stone throwing. Young men and boys in the streets of Gaza and the West Bank, facing Israeli soldiers with rocks. The images travel around the world. A superpower army. Children with stones. The moral arithmetic is impossible to ignore. Jerusalem becomes a battleground of a different kind. Not open warfare. Something more grinding. Strikes, protests, checkpoints tightened, curfews imposed. The sound of rubber bullets and the smell of tear gas become ordinary features of daily life in the occupied territories. Palestinian shops close in solidarity. Israeli security forces respond with arrests, deportations, and a policy that a defense minister calls breaking bones. The violence is not one-sided. Israeli civilians are attacked. Soldiers are killed. Fear settles into both communities like a cold that will not break. For 6 years, the Intifada grinds on. And then, in 1993, something extraordinary happens. In Oslo, Norway, in secret, Israeli and Palestinian negotiators meet. They eat together. They talk through the night. They argue. They find, in the exhaustion of long hours and shared meals, something that looks like the beginning of an agreement. Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, and Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli Prime Minister, shake hands on the lawn of the White House. President Bill Clinton stands between them, arms wide, as if physically holding the peace together. The Oslo Accords create the Palestinian Authority. They divide the occupied territories into zones of control. They establish a framework for negotiations toward a two-state solution. Jerusalem's final status is set aside, to be resolved in later talks. Both sides accept this deferral because the alternative is watching the agreement collapse before it begins. For a brief, strange, luminous moment, it feels like something has changed. In Jerusalem, people who have spent their entire lives in a city defined by conflict allow themselves to imagine something different. A Palestinian shopkeeper in the old city, an Israeli family in West Jerusalem. a young woman who has grown up knowing only checkpoints and curfews. They allow themselves, just for a moment, to imagine a future that does not look like the past. Rabin stands at a podium and says words that will be carved into his memorial. Enough of blood and tears. His voice is not the voice of a man delivering a speech. It is the voice of a soldier who is tired of war. You hear it, and something in your chest tightens. 2 years later, on November 4th, 1995, Yitzhak Rabin is shot dead by a Jewish extremist who believes the peace process is a betrayal. He is killed in Tel Aviv after a peace rally, walking to his car. The assassin is 25 years old. He acts alone, but he does not think alone. There are communities on both sides who see compromise as surrender, who see any acknowledgement of the other side's humanity as a form of defeat. The gunshot in Tel Aviv echoes through Jerusalem like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread outward and do not stop. The peace process does not die immediately. It limps forward. Negotiations continue under new leadership, but something essential has been broken. The momentum is gone. The trust is thinner, and the settlement expansion continues quietly, steadily, turning the map into a patchwork that makes a contiguous Palestinian state harder to imagine with every passing year. In the summer of 2000, at Camp David, American President Clinton brings Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Palestinian Authority Chairman Yasser Arafat together for a final push. The negotiations go to the edge of what either side believes possible. Proposals cross the table that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Jerusalem itself is on the table. Sovereignty over the holy sites. The future of the Temple Mount. Questions that have no clean answers, because the history underneath them is too deep and too painful for any formula to resolve. The talks collapse. Each side blames the other. Historians still argue about why, but the collapse itself is not in dispute. The two leaders fly home. The deal does not exist. And in Jerusalem, people who had allowed themselves to hope feel the hope drain away like water through old stones. 2 months later, in September of 2000, Ariel Sharon, the Israeli opposition leader, walks onto the Temple Mount with a large security escort. For Palestinians, this is not a visit, it is a provocation. The following day, after Friday prayers, protests erupt. The protests become riots. The riots become the Second Intifada. What follows is 5 years of sustained violence that will reshape both societies. Suicide bombings in Israeli buses and restaurants and markets. Military incursions into Palestinian cities. Checkpoints multiply. The separation barrier begins construction, a long concrete wall running through the West Bank, separating Palestinian communities from each other and from Jerusalem. Israel says it is necessary for security. Palestinians say it is annexation by another name. Both things can be true simultaneously. That is the particular cruelty of this conflict. In Jerusalem, the daily experience of the city becomes defined by fear and restriction. Israeli civilians avoid crowded buses. Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem carry identity documents everywhere, because the wrong document at the wrong checkpoint can mean hours of delay or arrest. The smell of the city changes, not literally, but the way a place feels changes when violence is a daily possibility. The markets are quieter, the streets empty earlier at night. The ancient stones absorb another layer of grief. 2 decades of peace processes, 2 decades of agreements that collapse, 2 intifadas. Palestinian uprisings that bring terror attacks and military crackdowns. The city that once welcomed 3 faiths now feels like a city at war with itself. Checkpoints separate neighborhoods. Settlements expand into Palestinian territory. And at the center of it all, the same stones that saw David dance with the ark, that saw crusaders massacre thousands, that saw Saladin show mercy. These stones now witness a conflict with no end in sight. The question that will define the 21st century is about to be asked. Can a city so sacred to so many ever belong to one people? Or is Jerusalem condemned to be contested forever? We have traveled through 17 destructions and rebuildings, through empires and exiles, through crusades and conflicts, through the modern nationalism that tried to solve the ancient problem of sacred space. And we end where we began, not with answers, but with the question itself. The woman's hand on the stone, the same gesture that has been made for 3,000 years. This is Jerusalem, dawn at the western wall. The sky is the color of ash turning gold. A woman in a dark coat presses both palms flat against the stone. Her lips move, her eyes are closed. She has waited her whole life to stand in this exact spot. Behind her, the city is waking. Somewhere in the Muslim quarter, a call to prayer rises above the rooftops. Somewhere in the Christian quarter, a bell answers it. The smell of cardamom and charcoal drifts from an early kitchen. The stone beneath her hands is cool, ancient, indifferent to what century it finds itself in. You have seen what she has not. You have watched this city burn 9 times and rise 9 times. You have seen the Assyrians march through its gates and the Babylonians tear them down. You have seen the Romans salt the earth and the Crusaders wade through blood, and Saladin ride in with mercy that stunned a world expecting slaughter. You have seen every empire that believed it had solved Jerusalem. Every single one was wrong. And now we arrive at the century that believes it can do what no empire managed, the 21st century. The age of international law, of United Nations resolutions, of peace processes with names we can recite like prayers, Oslo, Camp David, Annapolis, names that carry so much hope and deliver so little. The woman at the wall does not think about any of that. She thinks about her mother, who never got to come here. She presses her prayer into the stone and trusts it will be received. The separation barrier began rising in the early 2000s. Concrete slabs, 8 meters high in places, cutting through the West Bank like a scar. Israel called it a security fence, and in one sense, it worked. The suicide bombings that had turned buses and restaurants into killing grounds began to decrease. Families in Tel Aviv stopped flinching every time a bus door opened. That reduction in fear was real. It mattered to real people who had buried real children. But the barrier did not follow the 1967 border. It curved deep into Palestinian territory. It separated farmers from their fields. It cut communities in half. It wrapped around East Jerusalem in a way that made the city's future harder to imagine as anything other than permanent division. Palestinians in villages that had existed for centuries found themselves on the wrong side, not by war, by concrete. Rachel's tomb sits near the northern entrance to Bethlehem. For centuries, Jews, Christians, and Muslims visited it together. The tomb is sacred to all 3 faiths. The matriarch Rachel is buried there, if you believe the tradition, and millions do. After the barrier was built, the tomb ended up enclosed on the Israeli side of the wall, accessible to Jewish worshippers through a heavily guarded corridor, effectively cut off from the Palestinian city it had always been part of. 1 stone, 3 faiths, a wall between them. That is Jerusalem in miniature. The peace processes tried and failed in ways that deserve more than a paragraph, but the shape of the failure is important. At Camp David in the year 2000, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Palestinian Authority Chairman Yasser Arafat sat across from each other with American President Bill Clinton pushing them toward a deal. They came closer than anyone had before. They discussed dividing sovereignty over the old city itself, giving Palestinians control over the Muslim and Christian quarters, giving Israel the Jewish quarter and the Western Wall. They discussed shared administration of the Temple Mount, the holiest disputed ground on earth. They could not close the gap. The right of return for Palestinian refugees was the breaking point. Millions of Palestinians had been displaced since 1948. They wanted the right to go home. Israel said granting that right would end the Jewish character of the state. Both positions were sincere. Both positions were irreconcilable. Clinton blamed Arafat. Arafat blamed Barak. Historians still argue about who walked away first. What matters is what was lost. The moment passed. It did not come back. Annapolis in 2007 tried again. Different leaders, same geography, same grief. Palestinian Authority, President Mahmoud Abbas and Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert negotiated seriously. Olmert later said he had offered Abbas 93% of the West Bank, land swaps for the rest, and a shared arrangement for Jerusalem. Abbas said the offer was not enough. Olmert left office under a cloud of corruption charges before a deal could be signed. Another moment, gone. Meanwhile, Jerusalem itself kept changing on the ground. Settlement construction in East Jerusalem and the surrounding West Bank continued through every administration, every negotiation, every ceasefire. Each new building on contested land was a fact created in concrete, harder to undo than any signed agreement. Palestinian leaders called it annexation by construction. Israeli governments said the settlements were legal, necessary, permanent. The international community, through the United Nations and UNESCO, repeatedly declared the settlements illegal under international law. The construction continued anyway. You have to understand what daily life looks like inside this political architecture. Because the history of Jerusalem is not just the history of leaders in rooms. It is the history of a Palestinian father who leaves his house at 5 in the morning to reach his job on the other side of a checkpoint before the lines become impossible. It is the history of an Israeli grandmother who takes a different route to the market because her neighbor told her the old route felt unsafe. Fear is not abstract here. It lives in the body. It changes how you move through a city you love. East Jerusalem under Israeli administration is a city of competing realities. Palestinian residents hold permanent residency status, not citizenship. They can vote in municipal elections, but not national ones. They receive Israeli social services. They carry documents that mark them as something between citizen and foreigner in the city where their families have lived for generations. 3 administrations claim jurisdiction over different parts of the same city. 3 sets of rules. 3 visions of what this place is and who it belongs to. And yet, people live here. Children go to school. Bread is baked. Coffee is drunk on stone steps in the morning light. In the old city, a Jewish shopkeeper and a Muslim shopkeeper have been neighbors for 30 years. They argue about football. They share food during each other's holidays. They do not solve the political problem. They simply refuse to let it be the only thing between them. That is not a solution. But it is something. It is a kind of daily courage that the news never covers because it does not bleed. The international community has tried to resolve Jerusalem's status through declarations and resolutions for decades. The United Nations, in Resolution 181 back in 1947, proposed that Jerusalem become an international city under UN administration, a corpus separatum, a separated body belonging to no single nation. That proposal was rejected. It was never implemented, but it has never entirely disappeared either. Every few years, someone proposes a version of international sovereignty over the holy sites. Every few years, it goes nowhere. UNESCO has repeatedly passed resolutions affirming Palestinian cultural heritage in Jerusalem, referring to the Temple Mount by its Arabic name, Haram al-Sharif, in ways that infuriated Israel and its allies. The votes exposed a world deeply divided, not just about Jerusalem, but about how to even name what Jerusalem is. A holy city, a capital, an occupied territory, a symbol, all of these. None of these exclusively. In 2017, the United States under President Donald Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The decision was celebrated in Israel and condemned by most of the international community. The United Nations General Assembly voted 128 to 9 against the move, a vote that changed nothing on the ground and everything in terms of signal. Jerusalem had become a proxy for every unresolved argument about international law, national sovereignty, and the weight of history against the urgency of the present. But here is what those votes do not capture: the city itself, the actual stones and streets and people. Jerusalem in the 21st century is home to roughly 900,000 people: Jewish Israelis, Palestinian Arabs, Armenian Christians, Greek Orthodox priests who have maintained continuous presence here since the Byzantine era, Ethiopian monks who live on the roof of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, in small stone huts, guarding a tradition so old no one alive can remember when it began. Pilgrims from Nigeria and Brazil and South Korea who weep when they see the Via Dolorosa for the first time. Tourists from everywhere on earth pressing their hands against stone, looking for something they cannot name. The stone does not care who is in power. That is the strange, humbling truth of this place. The Western Wall stood while Rome fell. It stood while the Crusader kingdom rose and collapsed. It stood while the Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents and then shrank back to nothing. Every political arrangement that has claimed Jerusalem as its own has eventually ended. The stone remained. What does that tell us? Not that politics is pointless. People suffer and die because of political decisions made about this city. The suffering is real. The injustice is real. The fear on both sides is real. But it tells us something about the nature of sacred space, that it exceeds every human attempt to contain it. That the meaning people find in these stones is not a product of who controls the checkpoint outside. It is something older, something that lives in the act of return itself. 3,000 years of people coming back to this city, coming back after exile, coming back after destruction, coming back after massacre. The Jewish people returning after 2,000 years of diaspora. Palestinian families carrying the keys to houses that no longer exist, passing those keys to children who have never seen the houses, teaching them that return is not just possible, but obligatory. Christian pilgrims who have crossed oceans to walk where Jesus walked. Muslim pilgrims who have saved for years to pray where the Prophet ascended. All of them drawn back. All of them certain this place holds something they cannot find anywhere else. Maybe that is the answer. That is not an answer. Maybe Jerusalem's power is precisely its refusal to be solved. A city that could be divided cleanly, administered efficiently, stripped of its sacred charge, and turned into a normal capital with normal borders would no longer be Jerusalem. It would be just another city. What makes it Jerusalem is the unbearable weight of meaning it carries. The fact that 3 of the world's great faiths look at the same patch of ground and see the center of everything. That weight cannot be negotiated away. It can only be carried. The future of Jerusalem is uncertain. It may be divided forever. It may be united. It may become an international city governed by no single nation. But one thing is certain: the stone will remain, the prayers will continue, and people, Israelis, Palestinians, Christians, Muslims, Jews, pilgrims from around the world, will keep returning to this place, seeking meaning, seeking home, seeking redemption. Jerusalem is not a city to be conquered and held. It is a city to be endured. And in the endurance, in the struggle itself, there is a strange kind of grace. Not the grace of victory, but the grace of persistence. The grace of a place so sacred that no single person can claim it. The grace of belonging to everyone by belonging to no one. This is the complete history of Jerusalem, the story of a city that teaches us that some places cannot be solved. They can only be lived in, and loved, and wept over, and returned to, again, and again, and again.